There were some sections in Kane Parsons' Backrooms where I thought to myself, okay, I'm just straight up watching a horror classic, like an instant horror classic. And you know the ones that I'm talking about, these sections in the backrooms themselves with the found footage, the liminal space, that sort of stuff. You know, I was a huge fan of the concept. I've seen some of the original internet videos, not all of them though, so I'm not like fully versed in all the layers of the lore, but you know, I had seen enough of it to have me excited about this movie, and I went in and you know, there were indeed some parts where I was feeling, you know, that magic of the back rooms and the kind of strange appeal of it, the sort of sublime quality, which I'll talk about a bit later, but there were also some parts where I felt like the movie made some frustratingly conventional choices that just took me right out of it. Everyone, welcome back to the second channel. My name is Tom from main channel Like Stories of Old, and today I want to talk about Backrooms. In my original review that I wrote on Letterboxd a day after watching the movie, I feel like I was maybe a little bit more critical than I was now, because I will say, like, despite its flaws, this is a movie that I haven't been able to stop thinking about. And the concept, again, the concept of the Backrooms is just so appealing and enticing, and it so clearly has a kind of potency to it that immediately triggers or activates something in your mind that you want to sort of, it's kind of spooky and you want to run away from it, but also you kind of want to go in and explore. Again, there's just such a potency to it, and I wanted to quote Kane Parsons himself here. There was something that he said about what the Backrooms was about for him, but for the life of me, I can no longer find the quote. I've been trying, so I'm not 100% sure if this can actually be attributed to him, but for him, the Backrooms was sort of fundamentally about the human need to make maps, which I think is just this wonderfully broad statement that captures so much about what I also felt the Backrooms were about, because it obviously works on like a literal level. You know, the Backrooms are this endless space of strange hallways and rooms and whatnot, and there is a kind of need, like an immediate need, like, okay, I want to find my way in this, so I want to map this out. And we see a little bit of that in the movie also, where Clark obviously goes and maps out a large portion of the space as far as he can reach it. But it also works on more of a symbolical level, where we have this sort of need to understand the world that we're in and understand ourselves, which in many ways both are like strange and alien places to us that we long to kind of make some sense of. And while I think that basic idea is sort of present in this movie, I don't think the movie itself was as eloquent about it as it could have been. I already had a few critiques in my original review, but I've been thinking about it some more, and I think I've condensed it down to two problems that I want to talk about in this video, and maybe along the way also respond to some other responses to the movie that I've seen along the way and that have kind of informed my own thinking about it. Some that I agree with and thought were like pointing to something that I had missed, but also some that kind of recontextualized for me or kind of informed me about what I felt was missing for this movie, or missing in this movie. But just as a preface, I will say that I'm very happy this movie exists. I think it is an incredible debut film for a young filmmaker such as Kane Parsons. So more than anything, you know, this is coming from a place of like, I'm excited about where this can go and what's next, and I just want to see people and he himself get like the best out of this. And you know, it is very telling, I think, that I'm immediately holding this movie to like the highest standards, and that's only because I feel like it has that equal amount of potential. You know, I think the Backrooms definitely has the potential to be an all-time classic. I don't think this one is that just yet. You know, maybe in time I'll feel differently about it, but I'm still very excited about this movie. I've been thinking about it a lot. I've been thinking about the Backrooms as a concept a lot, and yeah, it's just fun to engage with, and that's also in part why I wanted to make this video, not so much because I wanted to offer my critique, but also just because I want to get some of this, what is going on in here, out there, and then hopefully I don't have to think about it anymore, and I will be able to sleep again at night. Oh, and just a warning, I'm just going to go straight into spoilers, so if you haven't seen the movie, go see it first and then come back to this video.
I found something. in the store.
So the first issue that I had with this movie was the way it tackles perspective and subsequently how information is dispelled to the audience. If we discount the prologue for a minute, there are three major expeditions into the backrooms. The first one is where Clark discovers them for the first time, obviously. The second one is when he's already spent a month in the place, and then he brings his employees into the space. And the third one then with Mary, who goes in to find Clark, who's at this point been missing for some time. While I think these sequences in themselves were great, especially the second one, which I thought was really, really well done, really immersive and evocative, I think the progression between these three sequences kind of resulted in this sort of stunted experience because, for me, the Backrooms is very much, it's more of like a moody thing, it captures a feeling that I would compare to like doing meditation or something, where you need to like cultivate the time to get into the zone and then stay there for, some magic to happen. Another thing you can compare it to is like a comedy show where you go to it and you have a few drinks and then over the night, you kind of loosen up and then the jokes become funnier and you just get into the vibe of it. And I think that also applies to the Backrooms, especially as a concept. It's not just something that you show to the audience, you also need to cultivate their presence in this place. And you want to cultivate their progressive immersion into this atmosphere, into this mood, into this vibe. And the problem with the way the movie goes about it now is that we basically have three separate sequences that are all from a different perspective. And more specifically, they're all from a perspective of a first-time entry into that zone. So in the first sequence, the audience is connected to Clark, and I think this one has the best sort of synergy between character and audience, where, Clark goes in the Backrooms for the first time, and so does the audience. We are immersed into the atmosphere of it just as he is. But then he comes out of it, which in itself is not an issue, but the problem is rather that once we get back in the Backrooms, time has passed and we are no longer in connection with Clark. At this point, we got to a moment where he's already been exploring, and then we got to the point where he wants to bring in his employees to film stuff, to get evidence. And at this point, our POV characters are really those employees because they're also coming in like what is going on, which then mirrors like our confusion at this point, where we weren't brought along with Clark's actions that preceded this moment. Because again, the movie just skips all over that. And the same thing happens with the third expedition. It's not so much that we were pulled out of that we are literally pulled out of the Backrooms in between, but it's also again that more time passes and we again shift perspective to someone who's going into the Backrooms for the first time. And the result of that is that we basically get three separate sequences that are structurally more or less the same, or at least in terms of emotion and immersion, they're kind of starting out from the same place. Whereas what you rather want to see is to have a sort of gradual descent into the depths of the Backrooms. And that's just something that I felt was missing, especially in between the first and second sequence. I was just hoping to see more of Clark's obsession with the Backrooms and to be brought along with him on like a more emotional level rather than just coming in a month later and then have him explain what has been going on. Because the thing is, the Backrooms, they have that certain appeal, they have the same appeal to the audience as they have to Clark. With a movie called The Backrooms, we obviously pay to see the Backrooms. The audience is longing for horror, they are longing for those liminal spaces, they want to go in the Backrooms. And so I think it was a really clever choice to have the character then also be someone who finds like a strange appeal in the Backrooms. And as a sort of side note, I also think it is a very clever decision to make the Backrooms enterable, that you can go in and out rather than just have some character go in once and then be stuck there. I think that introduced a great level of choice that gives the characters more agency, and that then also gives the audience potential mastery of the Backrooms. The idea that they can go in and out and just map it out gradually and get to understand it. I think that's just a great setup to facilitate a sort of safe entry into the Backrooms, which then later can be subverted once everything goes wrong, and as maybe they do reach a point of no return as they do in the second sequence. But not to get ahead of myself too much, what I wanted to say here is that I wanted to be immersed more in Clark's obsession with the backrooms, because that also mirrored mine, and I think it mirrored that of everyone in the audience. And so instead of skipping over all that, I would have hoped the movie kind of immersed us more in that process, in that part of the story. I can just imagine scenes where Clark is just up at night thinking about the back rooms, or he's during the daytime he's in the store thinking about the back rooms. He could have like customers down in the basement looking at furniture while he's like staring at that blank space in the wall where the back rooms are behind. I wanted to see the back rooms actually take over his sort of mental space, even if it was just like a quick montage of him coming in and out and drawing the maps and trying to figure out some stuff, and then see how that affects him on the outside. Maybe the outside world also starts to look more strange and alien. And you know what I'm talking about. I wanted to be immersed in that emotion that he was feeling at that moment. I just wanted to be part of the gradual exploration of the backrooms rather than just being told about it when the movie skips ahead later or to a later point. And as a quick side note, one thing that I was also maybe expecting here was that Clark maybe finds some of the artifacts from the other scientists, because that was one weird bit where you had a setup but no payoff, because the prologue shows this, it kind of establishes this scientist who's already went into the back rooms and then is killed or attacked by some creature there. And then when Clark first goes into the back rooms, he finds the bag with all kinds of tapes and footage, and that's when I thought like, oh, he's gonna pick it up and then we're gonna watch it, and then we get like a little bit more of the mystery, or at least that's gonna be part of the exploration of the backrooms. But then weirdly, he doesn't pick it up at all, and the bag is never mentioned again. It was just kind of strange. Again, I can imagine as a part of this section of the story that Clark did pick up the bag, and then also at night or during the day he checks out the tapes, and he becomes increasingly like fascinated and obsessed with the backrooms, to the point where he reaches that point of where he can no longer go any further without assistance, and that's when he brings in the employees, and then it continues as it did. I think that was a great sequence and a great way to subvert that initial establishment of safety. In that first act, you can still feel like you have some sense of control over the backrooms. You know the way in, you know the way out. At this point, you would have mapped out little bits and pieces, a feeling of gradual mastery. But then, of course, in that second expedition with the employees, with the rope snapping and everyone's pulled back into the hole that they cannot climb out of, and that's when the backrooms kind of subverts that in I think in a very exciting way. And again, I was just hoping there would be a little bit more emotional build up to that moment, or that I was more intimately part of the emotional flow that got us to that moment.
All right, just take it slow.
And again, as I said before, the third expedition also again sort of resets us back to zero, as we now follow Mary's character, I think she was called, as she goes into the backrooms for the first time. And while I would argue that is again another break in the flow that should have been, a gradual descent into darkness, and again breaks it up into one that is just kind of resetting us back to zero every time. I think what we also see here, which also happened in the second act, is that now, because there's a time jump, other characters who are no longer our POV character have to inform us about what has happened in the meantime. So again, in the first expedition, we were the POV character going into the backrooms, but then in the second one, we were already sort of playing catch up to Clark, who was no longer our POV character. To be fair, that sequence does kind of make us the POV character again as we tumble down into that hole where, for Clark too, it becomes unprecedented territory and an unprecedented situation, which then kind of locks us back into the perspective of that he has. But by switching to Mary in the third expedition, we are once again in a perspective or in a POV that is behind on information, and that we once again need to have Clark explain stuff to us. And I think the critical mistake, or the thing that I would have done differently, that I wished I had experienced differently, is that Clark sort of reveals the nature of the monsters that are present there before we even see the final one. Because this is the sequence where we get to meet the still lives, for the first time properly. We saw one at the end of the second act, or the second expedition, but here, this is where Clark really starts talking about them and what they mean. Basically, what he argues is that these still lives are badly remembered versions of people on the outside. But the thing is, he then says that there's also a version of him before we even see the sort of pirate Clark, and before we also see the final shot of Mary at the end, which of her like sort of double version, which I thought was just such a shame, because I do feel like that ending was effective, but it also felt like it lost some of its effectiveness by having it explained 20 minutes before we even see it. Because I do feel like, and I know people have sort of argued about this, whether or not the movie gives away too much or too little, or if the information it does reveal to us is accurate. There was someone who argued that Clark's explanation is just his interpretation of it, and that in reality he doesn't understand it at all. But I'm not sure if this is accurate, in the sense that what the movie, or what Clark says about the Backrooms, is also what the movie kind of affirms as it goes on, without like clearly subverting it. He says that there's a copy of everyone down here, and then in the end we see that there's indeed a copy of Mary there, and within the confines of the information that the movie provides us with, there is a consistency there, and I think you can theorize sort of beyond it or what it means. Maybe that person is right that Clark has it wrong, but with the way the movie is structured now, I just don't think the movie really argues otherwise. Like for me, even if you really wanted to keep that bit of exposition about how the Backrooms functions and what it does, like even if you don't understand the full extent of the meaning or purpose behind it, just the dynamics of copying stuff badly from the outside world, like I do feel like that should have been a revelation that shouldn't have come until the very end, until that very last shot. I just wish that, before Clark even starts monologuing about the Backrooms, he just gets eaten by the pirate version of himself, and we're like, what the hell, like that looks like a corrupted version of himself, and we just don't know what's going on until the very end, where it's then somehow revealed anyways. I also can't help but wonder if maybe Mary should not have been in this movie at all, even though I think the actress is great and her character was, not a problem in itself. I just wonder if it would have been more interesting if Clark had remained our sort of POV character throughout, and then maybe at the end, instead of him becoming the bad, crazed version, because that shift was also kind of jarring. Like I'm wondering if maybe there could have been a different villain for that third act, and maybe it's the scientist from the beginning, the one who got lost, and who's then also like a guy who sort of mirrors Clark's state of mind, but then in an advanced state. There's someone who's already kind of gone down that road of frustration and anger and delusion, all those things that Clark was heading towards, and so kind of jarringly reaches in that third confrontation. But just something that locks us in a more consistent POV without necessarily changing the character work that Parsons was going for here. I don't want to speculate too much, but this does also bring us to the second point that I wanted to talk about. The second problem that I have with this movie that for me kind of brought it down from being like an instant classic, and that's the problem with the movie's thematic focus and ambiguity. So a lot has already been said about what the Backrooms is about as a movie. People have already been speculating about it's about trauma, it's about processing trauma, it's about the Jungian shadow, about repression and the stuff that gets suppressed in our subconscious, which is then the Backrooms. Or at least the Backrooms is a symbol of the subconscious, where memories get distorted, and the more we revisit them, the more distorted it becomes. And my problem here is not so much the content of what is being discussed here. The problem is that the movie is mostly about the character's psychology in a direct sense, that puts the Backrooms, or that makes the Backrooms only important as a kind of subtextual layer to their character problems, whatever they may be, or however you might classify them. I think on their own, the character journeys are kind of clunky at best. Clark is kind of trapped in a failed marriage, in a failed job, in a failed society in some way, or at least to him, he had dreams about becoming this and that, and none of it panned out, which he then talks about endlessly with the therapist. And the therapist, of course, also had her own baggage. She has these flashbacks, she has the little symbol, the cemented hand as the trauma symbol that we cut back to over and over again until it's ultimately resolved by punching the monster over the head with it. All that stuff, no matter how you kind of spin it or try to kind of integrate it into some greater analysis, I think the way all that information is dispersed is just kind of clunky. Like there's not much emotional investment there. At no point did I did not feel like connected to Clark's problems on like a personal level. And the same goes with Mary, who besides her trauma and her role as a therapist is like a complete stranger to the audience. She has no life besides being a therapist to Clark and being a therapist with her own trauma going on. But again, even if you manage to tie that into a more cohesive sort of portrait of a human experience, I do still think that it's just fundamentally not the most interesting vehicle to attach the Backrooms to, or at least it's not the most interesting narrative to attach to the Backrooms, because going back to that original image, the first image that started the whole Backrooms craze, I think what was so powerful here, that was just like a single image with a little bit of text that sparked so much of the imagination. And I think that is because the Backrooms presents imagery or a visual concept that is meaningful in itself through direct experience, which is to say that it has an immediate and obvious power to it that does not need you to analyze it or add like layers of metaphor to it to explain it. It just has a potency to it that just works on such a viscerally direct level in a way that I don't think needed so much, explanation or rationalization, or because, attaching all those character journeys to it is, I think, a form of rationalization. It makes the Backrooms make more sense on a narrative level, because that's the thing, right? The thing that people are arguing for is mostly focused on what the Backrooms means to the characters, rather than discussing the Backrooms as a sort of entity and concept in itself. And that, I think, is the real shame here, that the Backrooms has now become more of the subtext to the text rather than the other way around. Obviously the Backrooms as an image, as a concept in itself, is inherently meaningful, but this is something that I've been thinking about ever since I did that video on Harmony Korine, who also talks a lot about the power of imagery on its own. And he said there in the context of some of his own films, that there are images that just have a direct impact without the need to analyze it. And whatever meaning they have is then the residue of that image. It's not that the image becomes meaningful because other meanings are attached or other analyses are attached to it. It's because the image itself, an image itself can be powerful enough to have its own distinct impact on the audience, or its own distinct impact on the one who watches. And with the Backrooms, there's just that kind of sublime quality to it, that it presents a space or a phenomenon that is so grand and so big and daunting that it becomes simultaneously alluring as something that kind of overwhelms you with grandeur, while also overwhelming you with the knowledge that it has the potential to destroy you. That's sort of the essence of the sublime. It's something that is simultaneously grand and all destructive, something that confronts you with your own smallness and your own fundamental vulnerability as a human being. And I know this is maybe less of a film critique than it is a creative difference that I have with this movie. Like for me, it should have been about the Backrooms first and then characters second. I think the architecture of the space should have been the thing that affected the psychology of the characters rather than the other way around, which is not how it works on a plot level, but which is, I think, how it works on like a greater narrative level, or like on a meta level, in the way that people are talking and sort of interpreting this movie now. They're kind of linking the two together, the psychological journey and the concept of the Backrooms, in a way that I don't think those two should be linked. I think this should have been more of a sensory experience first, and only then, once you've gone through it and you start kind of thinking about it, that's when kind of the meaning emerges. And even if a lot of those meanings end up being sort of the same, at least then it will have become something that the audience arrived at for themselves, rather than something that was more or less dictated through the movie. Because I do feel like a lot of the stuff, it's just so explicit now. The way that Clark talks about his guilt, the way that Mary overcomes her trauma of not being able to help people. I do feel like too much too much of that was explained, or at least they just gave us too many elements to kind of work those out in a sort of satisfying, cohesive interpretation. Whereas I feel like the main emotion at the end of this should have been like total discomfort and alienation. And I know the last shot still kind of does that, or at least I do like the way the movie wraps up with a kind of ambiguity, but still I think there was just too much there for people to latch onto, whereas I felt like it would have been more effective if there was even less. If the backrooms were just more of this vacuum, or like a narrative vacuum that the audience then has to it is sort of activated to engage with on like a direct emotional level, like that the one thing that they take away from the movie is like an unsettling emotion that they don't understand and then have to think about. Or, in a way that the Backrooms has made sort of a direct emotional impact, and then whatever meaning emerges is, again, it's residual. It's not like the primary metaphor of the movie, if that makes sense.
No. Clark.
And so yeah, that's kind of what I meant when I felt like the movie sort of reversed the subtext with the text. I think the Backrooms should have been the active force on the characters rather than the other way around. But overall still, again, just to emphasize once more, I did really enjoy this movie. I'm excited for a sequel to this. Like, I do worry because on the one hand, I do want to see a sequel to this. I do think there's a potential for a sequel that's even better, that gets even deeper into the horror and the ambiguity and the liminal spaciness of what the Backrooms are. But I do worry, and this was also part of my frustration, my light frustration with this movie, is that this is also like the kind of concept that you really only get like one shot at, or at least you only get to make one first impression with this. The second movie, if we go into the Backrooms again and it's just the yellow hallways again, it's just not going to have the same impact as seeing it for the first time in the first movie. So yeah, that's my main concern with a potential sequel. That, because there's already a built-in familiarity with the Backrooms, they have to kind of one-up it, and then they just kind of lose the intimacy of what it is. But I do have faith in Kane Parsons. I do think he's a very creative person from what I've seen on his YouTube channel. And from this movie, of course, I think his direction was very strong here. I think he understood the central concept of it very well, even if the script kind of failed to fully bring it out, in my opinion. So yeah, I'm excited to see what's next, and I'm definitely gonna go and check out more of his of the original Backroom stuff on YouTube. And yeah, it was just a great like 1-2 punch with Obsession, which I also saw I think 2 weeks ago at this point, and which I also thought was very good, and which I might also make a video on, because I also think the discourse around that movie has been very interesting. So yeah, I'll see if I'll be able to record that sometime soon. And in the meantime, thank you again for joining me on this second channel. Go see the Backrooms if you haven't already, and I'll see you in the next one.